I find camping especially relaxing, just being out in nature. It's already quite soothing on its own, but roughing it out in the middle of it all just adds a completely different layer to the experience. There's something about the simplicity of it all. It's inherently calming, peaceful. It's an experience you can't get in modern society anymore, and when your main concerns are nothing more than food, water, warmth, and shelter, it becomes a lot easier to lose track. It's a great way to take a brief moment to forget about the more indistinct worries of life, like success and fulfillment. It's not like camping is all fun and games, s'mores, campfires. There's always some element of real danger when you trade the safety of brick and mortar walls for the thin, flimsy fabric of a tent. Whenever you're camping in Yellowstone or even in your own backyard, this fact remains true. This risk is just another part of the experience, though. It makes the whole thing all the more exciting. That's not to say that it can't be taken too far, though. See, personally, I've had many harrowing and outright terrifying experiences when camping. In fact, for this very reason, more than a few campsites, which I've visited over the years that I've outright refused to ever return to. This story is about, well, one of those times. You don't usually expect anything to go wrong on the short camping trips. It's always on the long, multi-day treks through miles of wilderness that you expect to find real danger. It's usually the case anyway. I mean, it's not like you'll often run into an irate bear roaming through the small patch of woods behind your parents' house. Now, that is unless you live in the sort of area where that exact thing occurs. But that's besides the point. This story doesn't take place in that sort of area, and it most certainly isn't about a bear. Now, this story is about something that's a tad bit more unpleasant. This all happened quite a long time ago, back when I was in high school and only just starting to get into camping. My then girlfriend was the main driving force in that regard. She had gone on many camping trips, both with her family and while she was in the Scouts, so she was very much so an old hand at it. My family and I, on the other hand, we were quite the opposite. When your older brother has a laundry list of allergies that includes pollen and several species of grass, you're generally limited in the variety of outdoor activities that you can do as a family. Despite my inexperience, I took to it like a fish to water. In our first year of dating, we ended up going camping together at least once a month, if not more. Of course, living in the flatlands of central Illinois, our options for campsites were somewhat limited. That is, unless we particularly felt like pitching our tents in the middle of a cornfield. In spite of that, though, we had several spots that we regularly frequented. One of these spots was a campground in a decently sized park, about a 30-minute drive from my house. In truth, it wasn't exactly the most authentic camping experience, per se. You pulled off from the main road onto a gravel road that led into the woods, past these small gates, and after driving for a bit, you'd come across several loops of gravel paths arranged in a slightly misshapen four-leaf clover. Along each of these loops were several little numbered plots that each came with a fire pit of sorts. You'd pull your car into whichever free spot strikes your fancy and start setting up camp. After that, sometime usually before sundown, the caretaker of the campground, an elderly man who lives in an RV near the entrance with his wife, would come around and collect your payment. At $8 a night per tent was rather reasonable. I'd like to jokingly call it drive-in camping, but it wasn't like I didn't enjoy the convenience of it all. That evening was much like any other that we had spent out there, at least at first. We had just finished up and we began to settle in for the night. And something a bit outside the norm occurred. It was nearly sundown, around the time when the caretaker would usually lock up the gates, when a new arrival pulled into the campground. Their irritatingly bright headlights cut through the otherwise calm evening, announcing their arrival to the entire campground. The caretaker followed along just behind them, needing to collect their payment and get the new arrival settled before he could get back to closing up for the night. The late arrival wasn't an entirely uncommon sight at the campground, but it certainly wasn't a particularly welcome one either. Most everyone who visited the campground knew better than to arrive this late, as there wasn't exactly that much daylight left for them to set up camp. My girlfriend and I sighed, giving each other a knowing look. See, we were more or less familiar with the type of people that would usually pull this sort of thing, and neither of us were particularly happy to see them. We expected to see a pack of teenagers, maybe even some from our school, blasting party music out of Bluetooth speakers and sloppily setting up camp by the light of their headlights. It might sound a bit odd, given that we were teenagers ourselves, but we really hated their sort. Soon found, though, that this new arrival was more than a little far off from what we expected. Sitting around our campfire, my girlfriend and I watched on in uneasy confusion as the new arrival, their unnecessarily large truck, slowly approached, pulling into the spot right next to us. The caretaker seemed a bit perturbed by this as well. He glanced around the loop, noting that there were only 2 other groups in the campground that day, and that they were in completely different loops from us and this new arrival. Pulling up alongside the still-running truck, he talked with the driver for a brief few moments before directing them towards a spot much farther away from us. My girlfriend and I gave each other a relieved glance. Neither of us were particularly good with conversation, and we generally liked to keep to ourselves. We certainly didn't want a completely unnecessary and unwelcome neighbor. We decided to ignore this new arrival and get back to enjoying our evening, not wanting to let this little mishap ruin the entire night. We quickly found this difficult to do, however, as even more peculiarities drew our attention straight back to the truck some distance away from us. To begin with, the new arrival, a man who appeared to be in his late 30s, set up his camp remarkably quickly. His tent was completely pitched before the old caretaker had even made it back to his RV, and he had a fire going mere minutes after that. He was clearly experienced with this sort of thing. All finished setting up camp, the man returned to his truck and started unloading several items. First were 2 sizable duffel bags, which were tossed promptly into the tent. Next came a decently sized cooler and a camping stool, which soon found their place next to the fire. Pulling a beer out of the cooler, the man settled down into his seat, and then he just stared at us. His gaze was steady and unwavering, constantly fixed on us as he sat there and sipped his beer. My girlfriend and I were confused and unnerved. Did that man know us? Neither of us could think of any reason why he would. We didn't recognize his truck or the man himself, at least not from what we could make out of his distant features dimly illuminated by the fire. His attention made us uncomfortable, to say the least. Yet we tried to rationalize his behavior as best we could. Probably just a coincidence that he was looking in our direction, and even if it was purposeful, what was the harm of just looking? Not like there was really much of anything else to look at in the pitch-black campground. In the several hours that we had sat in front of our respective fires, the man did not budge an inch from his seat. His only movement had been to sip his beer and occasionally reach for another. Neither my girlfriend or I had been keeping count of his empty bottles, but we were certain that they numbered quite a few. We tried our best to relax and forget about the man, yet we failed miserably. Resigned, we ultimately decided to just turn in, hoping that out of sight, out of mind would get us through the night. My girlfriend was out like a light within minutes, and all the time I'd known her, the girl had never had any trouble sleeping. It was a talent, really. I, on the other hand, was much less fortunate with sleep. I spent hours laying awake in the tent, my thoughts racing. Try as I might, I couldn't get my mind off that man and all the possible reasons for his behavior. I wished in that moment that I hadn't spent the entire night prior watching true crime documentaries. It had definitely given me a healthy dose of paranoia. All it took was the sound of a single branch crunching just outside our tent to send all of my thoughts flying from my mind. The sound pierced the peaceful veil of night, drilling into my very core. I was laser-focused, listening for any trace of further sound. At first, there was nothing. But then came the occasional rustling of leaves, the rhythmic movement through grass. I hadn't noticed it at first over the chirping of insects, but someone was making their way slowly to our tent. My hand slowly inched closer to my pants pocket, even as the rest of me froze up. Reaching inside, I pulled out a small pocket knife I often carried with me on camping trips. I flicked the blade open with my thumb and held it close to my chest, my hands shaking. I felt less like a person preparing to defend themselves and more like a small child pulling their bed sheets up to their chin, trembling in fear of the monster in their closet. The footsteps came to halt just outside our tent. The dim light of the full moon was just enough to cast a faint silhouette of the unwelcome visitor against the side of the tent. I wasn't 100% sure, but it seemed like it could be the profile of the strange man. He stood there for a moment completely still, seemingly without even breathing. I might have forgotten he was there entirely if not for the looming shadow cast against the side of my tent. Then came movement, subtle enough that I wasn't able to tell exactly what was happening just from his shadow. I clutched my knife tighter, though, as a realization came over me. He was reaching out towards our tent. 5 slightly darker semicircles emerged from amongst his shadow as his fingertips came to rest gently against the fabric. They slowly started downward in a sort of meandering stroke as the man let out a slightly shuddering sigh of pleasure. The fingertips then drew back ever so slowly. My faint breath froze in my throat, full of fear as to what might come, and yet, nothing more came. The silhouette of the man faded into nothing as he receded into the night with muffled footsteps. I laid there, trembling for nearly half an hour before I was able to convince myself to calm down. As the fear receded, though, something that I was not quite expecting took its place. I was angry, more livid than I'd ever been in my entire life. I mean, how dare he fuck with us like this? I wasn't going to take it lying down. No, not this time. He had pushed me too far and I was done with it. I was ready to storm over to his camp right there and then, but I decided to wake up my girlfriend first. I wasn't so far gone in my anger as to leave her alone, asleep and unaware of what was going on. She wasn't entirely convinced I hadn't just had a nightmare or something, but she insisted on coming with me to confront the man. Now, I knew better than to try and convince her otherwise, and besides, I didn't quite want to admit it to myself. I was happy to not have to go alone. As we made our way across the campground, I found myself subconsciously silencing my footsteps as best I could. I mean, I was angry, sure, but that didn't mean I was more eager for confrontation than I usually was. The cool night air eased the adrenaline of anger, allowing a twinge of fear to creep back in as we neared the tent. I was able to muster up enough determination, though, as to not let my steps falter. My first attempt came out as a quiet squeak, hastily covered up with an embarrassing cough, but I eventually managed to call out a forceful "hey" as we entered the man's tent. However, in spite of my efforts, there was no answer. We waited a few moments, but there wasn't even a rustle of movement from the tent. I cautiously leaned in a bit closer, yet I couldn't even hear the faintest breath of sound from the tent. It seemed that the man was out. I realized then that when the man had left our tent previously, he hadn't actually left in the direction of his own tent. I had been too preoccupied with my fear to notice at first, but he actually seemed to do the exact opposite, heading directly into the woods surrounding the campsite. I swallowed my unease. I decided to take a look inside his tent. I mean, I know I could have gotten myself into a fair bit of trouble for doing so, but I couldn't just quietly go back to my tent empty-handed, not after all that had happened. I had no idea what I expected to find in there, other than just normal camping stuff, but I hoped that there might be something that would shed some light onto what had been going on. But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The tent was empty. Not just of occupants, but of any sort of possessions as well. The 2 duffel bags the man had tossed in previously were nowhere to be seen. There wasn't even any sort of indication that the man had ever had any intentions of actually sleeping there. I was completely caught off guard. I mean, I may have had no idea what to expect, but I certainly wasn't expecting absolutely nothing. Except that wasn't exactly the case. Upon a second closer inspection, I realized that there was, in fact, one thing inside the tent. Something I had missed at first glance. There was a strangely dirty piece of printer paper, slightly crumpled, discarded in the corner of the tent. Perhaps it had been left behind unintentionally. I carefully picked it up by one of its corners, flipping it over while also doing my best to avoid touching the suspiciously fresh-looking stains. It was a picture that the man had printed off his computer. Not just any picture, though. It was a picture of us. I almost immediately recognized it as a picture that my girlfriend had posted to her Twitter a couple of months ago. The man had made alterations, though. My entire face had been angrily crossed out in dark, heavy lines, which had been drawn with such force and anger as to completely tear through the paper. We didn't waste any time going to the camp manager with what we had found, and the police were called shortly after that. The 20 minutes or so that we had spent waiting inside the old caretaker's RV were incredibly stressful, to say the least. Thankfully, though, it was completely uneventful. The police took our statements when they arrived, and soon after began their search. They kept things very hush-hush, staying professional, yet perhaps not immediately taking the whole thing all too seriously. Around 10 minutes into the search, though, there was a sudden change in their demeanor. There was a bit of a radio chatter that I couldn't make out, and then any trace of good humor was gone, replaced by staunch seriousness with some distinct hints of unease. I later learned that this was when they had happened upon the man's belongings, abandoned in the middle of a small clearing that he had been in the possession of, covering with taped-down plastic sheets. They never told us exactly what they had found inside the duffel bags that had been out there, but to be honest, they really didn't have to. Our imaginations did all the work well enough. Neither of us were particularly eager to know exactly what the man had planned for us. They didn't find the man that night. They were able to identify him from certain DNA evidence that he left behind, though, and they eventually caught him a few months later during a random traffic stop a few states over, driving a stolen truck. All the same, though, what happened that night has still stuck with me over the years. In a way, I'm sort of thankful for that day. Things could have gone easily a lot worse for me and my then girlfriend, and in the end, I learned a valuable lesson. See, there really is something to that old Boy Scout motto of being prepared. Now I never go camping without a fully loaded firearm. Seems like the only reasonable thing to do. Hey there, kids, it's me, Mrcreepypasta, and thank you so much for listening to tonight's story, whether it be an episode of something, or tonight's podcast, or tonight's YouTube. If you guys are watching on YouTube, I strongly encourage you to click subscribe so that you're able to get all of the updates for the YouTube series that currently go on. And if you're not on YouTube and you're listening on the podcast, thank you for listening on Spotify, or on Google, or on iTunes, or wherever you happen to be listening from. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons, and you can always join them at patreon.com/Mrcreepypasta. People like Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Ken Lando Higuchi, Brianna Van Tine-Janzen, Chompski, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Sindee Barney, G Weevil 3, Diana Kraus, Stephen VanHuss, Chance Burnett, Tristain Pelton, Nico, TheGingerBroz, Dante Rowe, Raphael Rodriguez, Lastbladesong, Eliminator 86, Nebsky, SteampunkSinner, Kaleb Dougal, Daniel Poulsen, Sky Harbor, The Homeless Bird 93, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, Aaron Stormcrow, Barbara Macedo, Thomas Burgett, Azazel Rotten, Let's Get Scared, S-Man, Andrew Kirisuba Warnock, Bad Honey, Creepypasta Adam, Someone You Love, Brennan Wright, Said the King 56, and Somber Puppet. Thank you guys so much for your continued support, to all of you on Patreon, you guys that are down there in the description, and everyone else. And thank you all for listening and watching and being subscribed. Sweet dreams.